The grip came without warning, fingers closing above her elbow, not hard enough to bruise visibly, but precise enough to communicate exactly how this would end if she made a sound. Around her, the Meridian Foundation Gala hummed along in its glittering oblivion. Champagne flutes clinked. The string quartet had moved into Vivaldi. 300 of New York's wealthiest arts patrons drifted beneath the gilded ceilings of the plaza's grand ballroom, trading pleasantries and seven-figure commitments, completely unaware that in the velvet-shadowed corridor near the private terrace, a woman was being reminded of everything she'd spent 14 months trying to forget. What no one in the ballroom noticed, what Gareth Aldwell himself hadn't yet registered, was the man standing 20 feet away at the edge of the corridor. He was very, very still. His right hand rose to his left wrist. His thumb found the clasp of his watch. He pressed it open with a soft, deliberate click, and he began slowly to remove it. 3 hours earlier, Vesper Mallory had been the most confident woman in the room. That wasn't something she'd been able to say for most of the past 3 years. Confidence was something she'd had to rebuild, carefully, painstakingly. The way you rebuild a structure after the foundation has been deliberately undermined. It had taken time. But tonight, it held. Vesper was 29 years old and the senior provenance specialist at Whitfield & Cross, one of Manhattan's most respected auction houses. She had a doctorate in art history, a memory like a steel trap, and an instinct for authentication that had saved her firm millions. She was also, by every conventional standard, the largest woman in the room. At 5'4" and generously built, with deep brown skin and thick thighs that filled out her gown and hips that moved the way her late grandmother had always told her to let them, like they own the floor, baby. Vesper had spent years being encouraged, in 100 quiet ways, to apologize for her body, to minimize, to make herself easier to overlook. Not tonight. Tonight she wore a custom deep burgundy silk charmeuse gown, with a structured open back and a thigh-high split she'd had made specifically for this occasion. The color worked with the warm undertones of her skin in a way that made her luminous. The cut didn't minimize anything. It celebrated every curve, every inch. She had worn her dark natural coils loose and full, the way she liked them, and the only jewelry she wore was a teardrop ruby pendant that had belonged to her mother. 45 minutes ago, she had successfully negotiated the evening's highest lot, a Basquiat canvas, untitled, red weight, originally estimated at 4.2 million, had gone to a Munich private collector for 6.8. The room had actually applauded. For the first time since she'd left Gareth, Vesper felt powerful, not performing power, feeling it. She was crossing toward the champagne service when the smell hit her first. Bergamot and bourbon, a very specific combination she had worked hard to stop reacting to, because it still had the power to drop her stomach through the floor. She stopped walking. She made herself turn slowly, the way you turn when you already know what you're going to see. Gareth Aldwell stood 15 feet away, looking like he'd been waiting. He was 41, with the kind of face that photographed beautifully and in person communicated something colder. He wore a winter white tuxedo, his signature, and the bourbon flush on his cheeks was already present, which meant he'd started early. He always started early at charity events. Nobody monitored how much a man drank when he was handing over a check for 6 figures. Vesper's grip tightened on her evening bag. 14 months, Gareth said, tilting his head like she was a curiosity. His voice was low, pleasant, perfectly calibrated for a party. I didn't think you'd have the nerve to come back to this world. I work in this world. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to. I have every reason to be here. His eyes moved over her, slowly, deliberately, the way she'd once mistaken for admiration. She understood now that it had never been admiration. It was inventory. You look like you've been comfortable since you left. The emphasis on comfortable landed exactly where he meant it to. I need to get back to my colleagues, Vesper said. Of course. He stepped aside, and then his hand shot out and closed around her upper arm. He did it without violence. That had always been his particular skill. The grip was firm, conversational, the kind a partner might use to guide someone through a crowd. But his thumb was pressed into a nerve cluster just above the joint, and if she pulled away, it would look like she was making a scene. He had spent years perfecting this, the cruelty that looked from a distance like affection. He guided her out of the main ballroom and into the private corridor near the terrace, where the catering staff moved back and forth and the lighting dropped to something amber and shielded. Once they were out of the ballroom's sight lines, the pleasantness dropped entirely. "You embarrassed me when you left," Gareth said, his voice still at a murmur, his grip tightening. "You packed a bag like a frightened child and disappeared, and I had to explain to people who matter why my partner vanished without a word." "I left because I was afraid of you," Vesper said flatly. "You were dramatic." He said the word the way he'd always said it, like it was a diagnosis. "You were dramatic and insecure, and convinced the world was conspiring against you because men weren't lining up to." He gestured, a sweeping dismissal that took in all of her, "deal with all of this." The words landed. She felt the old contraction in her chest, the younger, more frightened version of herself surfacing like a reflex. But something harder pushed back. "Let go of my arm, Gareth." "I don't think so." He pressed his thumb deeper, and the pain spiked sharp and immediate. "You're going to tell me where the Reinhardt files are, the documentation from 2022. I know you took copies when you left." He watched her face and smiled when he saw the recognition there. "There it is. You thought you were being clever, Vesper, saving all those files, waiting for your moment." His voice dropped. "Give them to me tonight, or I will call every major house, every private collector, every curator on the East Coast. You will be done, not just at this firm, done. You'll spend the rest of your career authenticating estate sale watercolors in New Jersey." She opened her mouth. "Take your hand off her." The voice came from the shadows at the corridor's far end. It was not loud. It was not the kind of voice that needed to be. Gareth turned. Vesper looked past him. The man standing at the edge of the corridor was tall. Not theatrically so, but the kind of height that combined with the breadth of his shoulders to fill a space without announcing itself. He wore a charcoal three-piece suit, the collar open just far enough to suggest he dressed for the room, but didn't particularly answer to it. Dark hair, olive skin, eyes that were an unusual shade of grey, the colour of deep water before a storm. Both his hands were relaxed at his sides. The watch that had been on his left wrist was gone. Gone into his breast pocket, from the look of the slight weight there, and his forearms, where his cuffs had been folded back, showed a faint tracery of old marks that suggested a man who had used his hands for things that didn't make it into press profiles. "This is a private conversation," Gareth said, recovering quickly. He'd had years of practice. "Walk away." The man took 3 unhurried steps forward until he stood fully in the light. "I'll say it once more," he said, his grey eyes fixed on Gareth's grip on Vesper's arm. "Remove your hand." Gareth's chin went up. "Do you know who I am?" "Gareth Aldwell." The man's voice was even. "I know exactly who you are." He reached into his jacket and produced a single folded document, not a weapon, but the way he held it, the way his attention moved from Gareth's face to Gareth's hand and back, with the quiet patience of someone running a very specific calculation, made the fine hairs on Vesper's arms stand upright. "Your firm has 16 active accounts with Carrera Imports," the man said. "All of them carry provenance documentation routed through the same Rotterdam notary who was sanctioned by Interpol in 2021. I know this because that notary has been working for my interests for some time, until last Thursday, when I handed his complete records to the FBI's art crime team." He paused, a beat of silence that he let breathe. "Which means every transaction through those accounts is under active federal review. Which means you are under federal review. Which means the last thing you want to do tonight, in a room with 300 witnesses a hallway away, is give me a reason to call the agent in charge and report that I personally watched Gareth Aldwell assault a woman at a charity gala. The silence lasted 4 full seconds. Gareth's grip released. Almost involuntarily, the way a hand opens when the signals misfire, Vesper stepped back, pressing herself against the corridor wall, her chest heaving. Gareth took a step toward the man. The man did not move, did not blink, did not shift his weight. "Who are you?" Gareth demanded, and something new had entered his voice, the beginning of real fear. "Alaric Nocera," the man said, "and I'd strongly suggest you go back into that ballroom, drink some water, and think carefully about tonight's decisions." What followed was not a fight. There was no dramatic crash, no raised voice, no scene. Alaric simply stepped forward, placed one hand on Gareth's shoulder with the absolute authority of someone who had never once in his life needed to explain himself twice, and guided him, steadily, back toward the ballroom entrance. He said 4 words that Vesper couldn't hear. Gareth went. His face, turned back over his shoulder, was the color of old plaster. Alaric watched him go, then he turned, and when he looked at Vesper, the predatory stillness in his face shifted into something she hadn't anticipated at all. "Are you hurt?" he asked. It took her a moment to answer, because she was shaking, and she didn't want to be, and he was watching her with the direct and careful attention of someone who was genuinely asking. "My arm," she said. He crossed the corridor and stopped 2 feet in front of her, close enough to be present, far enough that she could breathe. He didn't reach for her arm without asking, "May I look?" She nodded. His hands were warm, larger than Gareth's and steadier. He turned her arm gently, examining the reddening marks above her elbow, and the muscle in his jaw ticked the way a person's does when they are holding something back deliberately. "Nothing broken," he said, "but ice would help. Can you walk?" "I can walk," Vesper said. "I'm fine." "You're shaking." "I'm aware." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "There's a private lounge on the 3rd floor. My associate has the key. Come, only if you want. No obligation in either direction." She looked at him directly for the first time without the buffer of immediate crisis. She worked in a world of old money and private capital, of institutional wealth that preferred its power understated. She knew the name Nocera Capital the way she knew certain artworks, by reputation rather than by proximity. It was the kind of firm whose principles didn't appear in financial profiles and didn't need to. "You said that notary worked for you," she said. Past tense, Alaric replied. "You handed his records to the FBI. The art crime team specifically." "Why?" He held her gaze for a moment. "Because what Aldwell has been doing to provenance documentation in this city is an insult to every honest institution and every legitimate collector who has spent decades building a clean market." He paused. "And because I have attended 3 of these foundation events in the past 2 years, and every time you were the most capable person in the room, and it was a waste to watch a man like Aldwell talk over you in public." The honesty of it was unexpected enough that she didn't know what to do with it immediately. "You noticed me," she said. "Vesper," Alaric said, with a quiet certainty that sounded like it had been true for a long time. It was not difficult. The 3rd floor lounge was quiet and cool, with a leather sofa, a bar cart, and a window that looked out over the dark green geometry of Central Park. Alaric's associate, a lean, silver-haired man named Saul, brought ice wrapped in a linen cloth and stepped back. Alaric sat in the chair across from Vesper, not beside her, and let her hold the ice herself. Saul returned 11 minutes later. His face was composed in the practiced way of someone who delivers bad news without inflection. "Aldwell made a call from the ballroom," Saul said. "He's contacted the Whitfield and Cross Board. He's claiming Ms. Mallory removed confidential provenance files from the firm's secure archive prior to her departure. He's alleging industrial theft and pushing for immediate termination and a civil complaint." Saul looked at Vesper with something like genuine regret. He's also contacted his attorney about a statement for industry press. 9 a.m. tomorrow. If it goes out, her name is in the headline before she has any opportunity to respond. Vesper lowered the ice from her arm. He wants to control the narrative, Saul continued. He has 2 board members who have consistently voted in his favor. He has been preparing this for months, in the event she ever came forward with what she found. The cold returned, not the ice, the one she recognized. Gareth had told her, the last night she'd seen him, that if she ever tried to use what she knew, he would make her disappear so thoroughly that no one in the industry would say her name without flinching. She had believed him. He had resources, relationships, leverage she couldn't match. She had a folder of evidence saved in 3 encrypted cloud drives, and the quiet, dogged knowledge of exactly what he'd done. Alaric was watching her. He didn't rush the silence. "Tell me what you have," he said. Vesper sat forward. "The Reinhardt collection." Her voice was steady now, the provenance specialist, not the frightened woman. Heinrich Reinhardt, German private collector, died 2019. His estate brought 41 works to Whitfield and Cross for auction in 2021. 37 cleared provenance review without issue. 4 didn't. Documentation gaps between 1938 and 1946. Incomplete chain of custody through the war years. She met Alaric's eyes. Under the HERE Act, those 4 works should have been flagged, held from sale, subjected to extended review. They were not flagged. "Who cleared them?" Alaric asked. "The authentication came through with a Rotterdam certificate, from the same notary, the one you handed to the FBI." She paused. "Gareth signed the override. I flagged the issue in writing at the time. He overruled me and told me I was overcomplicating a clean transaction. 3 months later, when I pulled the transaction records myself, I found the wire trail. The Reinhardt lots sold for a combined $19 million. $8 million of that routed through a shell holding company in the Channel Islands before it returned clean." She held his gaze. Carrera Imports is the same shell structure. Saul had stopped looking at his phone. "I have the wire confirmations," Vesper continued. "The shell company incorporation documents, my original flagged authentication request with Gareth's override notation attached, and 17 additional transactions going back 38 months, the same channel, the same Rotterdam notary, all bearing Gareth's approval signature." She exhaled slowly. "I've held them for 8 months. I didn't know what to do with them because I was scared, and because he has positioned himself carefully for years, and I am." She stopped. "You are what?" Alaric asked, and his voice was quiet enough that it wasn't a challenge. "Not the person the room expects to be right," she said. "When someone like me calls out someone like him, the default assumption is that I'm angry, or confused, or biased. It's always something." Alaric was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "We stop allowing the room to assume." He looked at Saul, who was already moving toward the door. "The art crime team has been building their own case for several months," Alaric said. "They've had the financial architecture but not the internal documentation, not the direct paper trail showing Gareth's override of your authentication flag. With what you have, they don't need another 4 months of reconstruction. They have the evidence in his own handwriting." His grey eyes held hers steadily. "He's called a press statement for 9 a.m. The board vote on your termination is at 8. Can you be there?" Vesper thought about the burgundy silk dress still hanging in her closet. She thought about her mother's pendant. She thought about every room she'd ever walked into and made herself smaller in. Folded herself down, kept her voice careful, kept her evidence encrypted, and waiting because she was afraid, because the time was never right, because she was always one argument away from being reframed as the problem. "Yes," she said. The boardroom at Whitfield and Cross occupied the top floor of a pre-war building on East 72nd Street. At 8:04 on a Thursday morning in November, it smelled of fresh coffee and fresh anxiety, and the 6 board members arranged around the mahogany conference table had the look of people convened for a crisis they'd been assured would be simple. Gareth sat at the head of the table with his personal attorney at his elbow and his right hand laid flat on the wood in the posture of a man who had been wronged but was, graciously, willing to be reasonable about it. The winter-white tuxedo had been replaced by a winter-white suit. He still dressed like the center of the photograph. The doors opened at 8:07. Vesper walked in first. She had gone home, changed, and returned, and in the hours between she had made two decisions. She had dressed for the woman she was in the process of becoming, not the woman she'd been when she was with him. She wore a deep tobacco-brown structured blazer over a cream silk blouse, wide-leg trousers, and heels that struck the hardwood with a sound like punctuation. Her coils were down, loose and full. She wore her mother's ruby pendant. She looked entirely, completely like herself. One step behind her and to the right, Alaric Nocera entered. Charcoal suit, no overcoat. His watch was back on his wrist. His hands were relaxed, clasped loosely behind his back. He did not introduce himself. He did not need to. Two board members recognized him. She could see it in the way they straightened. Gareth's attorney leaned toward his client and said something urgent at a volume the room couldn't hear. "What is this?" Gareth said, looking at Vesper. His voice was controlled, but his color was already rising. "You have no standing at this meeting. You're under criminal review." Actually. A third person entered behind Alaric, a trim woman in a navy blazer with a federal badge clipped at her hip and a leather portfolio in her hand. "We're going to need everyone to remain seated for the next few minutes." She set the portfolio on the table. "Special Agent Miriam Torres, FBI Art Crime Team. We have some questions about the provenance certification process for the Reinhardt collection and a number of related transactions dating to 2020. Gareth moved to stand. "Please sit down, Mr. Aldwell," Agent Torres said pleasantly. She was already opening the portfolio. Vesper walked to the center of the table. She set a small encrypted drive on the mahogany, calm, deliberate, like placing a chess piece. 17 transactions, she said, addressing the board directly. $31 million moved through Carrera Imports over 38 months. I flagged the authentication issue internally in January of 2022, in writing, with full documentation. Gareth overruled my flag and approved the sale. I have his signature on the override." She looked, without flinching, at the two board members she knew had been in Gareth's corner for years. "I have a great deal of documentation. The FBI has more." "She is lying," Gareth said. "She is a disgruntled former employee who—" "The Rotterdam notary's testimony was received last week," Agent Torres said, not looking up. "He has been remarkably cooperative." Gareth's attorney put a hand firmly on his arm. Gareth looked at Vesper. She had braced for the moment, had expected something complicated in herself. Some residue of the fear, some flicker of the old guilt, the old sense that she was doing something she would eventually pay for. She felt none of it. What she felt was clean and clear and absolute, the settled certainty of someone who has been right about something for a long time and is finally standing in a room where being right is allowed to count. "I built this case over 8 months, Vesper said. "I built it while I was still recovering from what you did to my sense of what I was worth. I built it because I am very good at my job, and because the works we handle come from real histories that deserve honesty." She picked up her bag from the table. "I am done being small in rooms where you're present, Gareth. I am done." Gareth Aldwell was placed under federal arrest at 8:41 a.m. He was escorted through the lobby of Whitfield and Cross in handcuffs, past the glass cases displaying catalog photography for upcoming sales, past the receptionist who had once relayed his notes, telling Vesper she wasn't quite ready for client-facing work. The press had gathered outside by then, but not for the story he had planned to give them. Vesper stood at the boardroom window afterward and watched the grey November street below. She heard Alaric come to stand behind her, not beside her, giving her the moment. Outside, a car pulled away. The street returned to its ordinary morning rhythm. "What happens now?" she asked. "To the case, the Bureau takes it from here. The firm will need an independent review of its entire provenance process. That's probably a 6-month overhaul minimum." A pause. "If you were interested in leading it, I suspect no one in this building would raise an objection." She turned to look at him. In the grey morning light, his eyes were exactly the shade she'd first thought, deep water, complicated and still. "And to the rest of it?" "That," Alaric said quietly, "is entirely up to you." She thought about the word comfortable, and the cold surgical precision with which Gareth had weaponized it. She thought about all the rooms she had made herself smaller in, all the evidence she had held in encrypted folders instead of in open hands, all the times she had told herself the moment wasn't right, the person wasn't right, the circumstances weren't right, that she wasn't ready yet. "I want coffee," Vesper said. "Real coffee, not the boardroom kind. And I want to know which of these 3 Foundation galas you were actually there to attend, and which ones you came to because of other reasons entirely." Alaric reached for his coat. "I'll drive." She walked out of the boardroom beside the most dangerous man she had ever met, into a morning that belonged entirely to her, and felt, for the first time in years, like the version of herself who had never needed to apologize for taking up space.